I'm Connor Holt, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we are looking at Clint Eastwood's 2006 intimate epic World War II drama, Letters from Iwo Jima. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe has been forgotten to time. Every year, starting with the years 2013, we've been working our ways back. We did 2007 last year. This year we're doing 2006. Next year is going to be 2005, and so on. And essentially how the show works is three parts. The first part is the historical context. Why was this movie nominated? Where were we at the Oscars at the time? What other movies were winning? Then my thoughts on the movie, and then finally trying to answer that central question as to why this movie has been forgotten instead of some of the others. And like I say in every show, forgotten is a relative word, in the sense that it may not have been forgotten to you. Of course, this is still a Clint Eastwood film. This is still a celebrated movie. Every year there doesn't necessarily have one movie that fits exactly into the show's rules, but I try to pick one movie that maybe hasn't necessarily even been forgotten, but is maybe less celebrated than something like even The Departed or Little Miss Sunshine. And that was really the year this year, so the 2006 Oscars. And when I think of these movies, I think we're actually at the start of what I would consider the 2000s, the aughts, we'll call them, for the next probably 5 or 6 episodes. Because when I think of the decades, I always think about how really when we see movies that are like at the edges of the decades, they're really more emblematic of the next decade to come, whereas the movies in the middle of the decade are very emblematic of said decade. So when I think of, a movie like Little Miss Sunshine, I think of the 2000s, but when I think of a movie like The Dark Knight, which was actually released in the 2000s, in 2008, I actually think more about it as a 2010s movie because of how dominant that decade was with superhero movies and how so much of it was influenced actually by The Dark Knight and Iron Man and that kind of year. So we're at the start of the 2000s Oscars, and this year in particular was the Martin Scorsese Oscars. At this point, Martin Scorsese had never won an Oscar, despite making several masterpieces, in my opinion and in the opinion of many people at the time. We have filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson, who are starting to make their own movies, be so admired by Goodfellas and Taxi Driver, and they really sort of grew up on his films. And these guys are starting to make movies and get awards. Yet someone like Martin Scorsese hasn't won one. So because of his sort of the Goodfellas miss there and his sort of weird post-90s period, really the early 2000s was just Scorsese trying to get an Oscar. Gangs of New York in 2007 was a big Harvey Weinstein push, which ultimately got 10 nominations but 0 wins. Then The Aviator, a couple years later, gets 5 wins, and Martin Scorsese's nominated for Best Director, but doesn't get an award for Martin Scorsese. So when this comes back around, it's like, it's a crime movie, it's DiCaprio, it's Damon, it's Jack Nicholson, it's Wahlberg. It was sort of just poised in many ways to be the great movie that I think it is, and ultimately be that Best Picture winner. And that's how it went down, finally getting a Best Picture win, but also, more importantly, that coveted Best Director win for Martin Scorsese. Well overdue, but still, The Departed, a great movie in its own right. Then, in terms of the lead acting roles, you had Helen Mirren and Forest Whitaker win, respectively, in pretty sort of dominant wins. There was no sort of competition or race out of the night. Best Supporting Actress went to Jennifer Hudson for Dreamgirls, which was a movie that also did very well, and particularly in the Supporting Actor category, we thought that maybe Eddie Murphy would win for Dreamgirls. Unfortunately, he lost to Alan Arkin for Little Miss Sunshine, and this maybe represents the last time Eddie Murphy's ever going to get an Oscar nomination, or maybe a serious chance at an Oscar win. Looking back on it, it's one of those things where it's like, man, you most likely would have wanted to give it to Eddie here, and then maybe Alan Arkin in a couple of years for Argo. So it's kind of an odd situation. Looking back on things, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but I'd love to see Eddie Murphy get the Oscar there. So when choosing the movie, I didn't go with The Departed because it's tied to Martin Scorsese and is a well-respected movie in its own right. Little Miss Sunshine I could have picked because I think that has an interesting kind of very Sundance-y feel. The indie Sundance movie, I think, in many ways is defined by Little Miss Sunshine, but I think it's a little bit too relevant, a little bit too popular, has these great actors, Steve Carell, whatnot. So it has a little bit of a cult following in that respect. I could have gone with Babel, which is kind of the first big Oscar effort of Oscar legend at this point, Alejandro Iñárritu, who's won 4 Oscars and had The Revenant and had Birdman as well, and it seems to be always his movies are in the Oscar conversation. This was his sort of first bid at that, and got a nomination for Best Director as well. But like I said, I didn't want to pick it because it is tied to Alejandro Iñárritu, and he's such a beloved Oscar figure that his movies necessarily aren't fading in relevance. It has big stars, Brad Pitt and whatnot. And then The Queen, I thought about maybe doing, but you would also argue that it's become more relevant than even it was at 2006, because the writer, Peter Morgan, went on to create The Crown, and that's a hugely successful TV show, and in many ways sort of started it off here with The Queen. So you could say that if you're a fan of The Crown, you'll probably go back and watch this movie just to see more of that Queen content. So in many ways, the choice became clear to go with Letters from Iwo Jima, which even at the time was a surprise nomination. If you remember, Letters from Iwo Jima didn't get a BAFTA nomination, didn't get Clint Eastwood for DGA, didn't get a Golden Globe nomination, so in many ways it was a surprise that it got in here, because for a lot of people, this movie, if you don't know, has kind of a sister movie, also directed by Clint Eastwood, released 2 months earlier, called Flags of Our Fathers, which is about, both movies are about the Battle of Iwo Jima, one about the American viewpoint, the other from the Japanese viewpoint, although the movies are actually, different in many ways, where this one is very much about the battle, the American one is much more about propaganda and the photo op of the flag carriers and their journey, rather than the battle itself. But it is sort of two sides of the same coin, released a couple of months within each other, so there was a lot of comparison as to well, if you're going to nominate one, do you have to nominate both? And there's a sort of sister movie aspect to it. So it was a little bit of a surprise to see Letters from Iwo Jima pull ahead and ultimately get that nomination. And looking back on it, it does make sense that it was nominated, because Clint Eastwood's last movie, $1 Million Baby, won Best Picture, so his follow-up, which was also critically acclaimed, which did well at the box office, seemingly would get nominated for Best Picture, and it did. However, I think, unlike $1 Million Baby, this one has a little bit more of an under-the-radar reputation, unfortunately. So now transitioning into my thoughts, I say unfortunately because I really enjoyed the movie. While I also liked Flags of Our Fathers, I would say that Letters from Iwo Jima is probably my preferred of the two, just because I think it has a little bit more of a simplistic, less ambitious story, but a clear message, and overall is a little bit more of a cohesive kind of a movie, and focused, I guess would be the word I would use. But I do enjoy both movies, and what I like about this movie is that, particularly in terms of war movies, most war movies aren't necessarily about war. It's incredibly difficult to talk about the entire all-encompassing war in just 2 hours. That most of the time, war movies are just about battles. But the good war movies use the battles to tell a larger story about the war itself. And I think Letters from Iwo Jima does exactly that. I think through its battle and through its construction, we really are able to understand many aspects of the war. And in the first hour of the movie, there is no fight scene. There's no battles. This is not like Saving Private Ryan. The first 20 minutes, you get a big action-packed sequence. The first hour is spent on getting to know these characters. And the structure of the movie, I think, is very key to why it succeeds. That first hour without any battles, really get to know a lot of things, set up themes, get to know these characters. So on one hand, we get to know these characters a bit better. We see Ken Watanabe's character, who's the general. We see a sort of another a soldier played by. We get to know a little bit more about the general, played by Ken Watanabe. There's another sort of Japanese lieutenant who is a former horse rider in the Olympics. Then there's also sort of a one rank below soldier, a Saigo, who is a measly baker who sort of got drafted into the war. And we see things from these 3 men's different perspectives, but there's also characters as well. And what we really understand is their perspectives and why they're here, and there's some resistance as to some of them have a duty and honor, but some of them necessarily don't want to be there exactly, some of their motivations. And what this really does is provide a humanist lens to the movie. When we get into battle, well, we actually know these guys very well. We know their backstory, we know their kind of relationship with one another, we know their kind of outlook on life. So we connect more with these characters, so we care more about them when it comes to the battle time. However, I think this movie is also very clever in the sense that this first hour is not just about establishing characters and making you understand and empathize with them and provide sort of a humanist tale to the traditional sort of enemy of the movie. That in many ways, this first hour represents the theme of loss. This movie is very melancholic and dreadful in many ways, in the sense that it is about dread. This is a situation where the people in it, even the generals, are seemingly being lied to or devoid of information as to their chances of winning, and that even before they fight, they realize that their ships are gone, their airfields are gone. It's pretty much just the people who are already on the island, and they have a very low chance of winning, and the tide of the war is shifting, and they kind of have to realize this. And it's the first hour of the movie, if you think about it. There's a lot of time where we're allowed to ruminate on this idea, and when there's moments of joy, they're immediately undercut with sort of meaningless superstition or bombing and firing, where they have to stay inside these man-made caves. So many of the characters in real time are kind of reflecting on, like, this is my death, this is going to be the end. How do I want to go out? Do I want traditional kind of respect the honor of the emperor, or fight until the dying breath, more like the Americans? Or do I want to surrender, even though it goes against my culture? There's all these different kinds of dread that goes on throughout the movie that I think really emphasizes that theme of loss, so that in the second half, yes, we understand these characters better. Yes, it's more of a humanist kind of perspective, but it's also sort of this slow car crash that we can't wash our eyes from. And they know it, and we know it, and it becomes very much sort of a somber, melancholic way of doing that. And then another technique that they've used, Clint Eastwood in particular has chosen, is making this movie incredibly desaturated. That there's not very bright colors. A lot of the actors' clothes blends in with the background, which in the actual color gradient of the film is desaturated. And what this does is create an incredibly somber, depressing kind of a mood. That these guys are stuck on this island, waiting for their death. There's no vegetation anywhere. Even some of the battle scenes aren't very sort of gory or graphic. It's just sort of like flesh on top of this sort of rubble, seemingly meaningless kind of point. And I think because of this decision to desaturate, it really emphasizes the mood and the despair that these men were in, that they really were in the trenches, physically, metaphorically. But they also can see things coming. They're not dumb enough to just blindly go into the end and still think they're going to win. They know that they're going to lose, and because of that sort of somber attitude and because of the somber kind of visuals, it creates this really interesting, I think, meditation on dread and this interesting sort of contemplation on, my life is going to end soon. It's going to end in this battlefield. A, how do I want? And B, how do I feel about that? How am I coping with that, essentially? And these different perspectives of a general who's well respected, of a man who is here to bring sort of the hopes up in the horse rider, of there's a normal soldier who got drafted here, thinking about his pregnant wife at home. All these different elements of kind of moral reflection and reflection on their own mortality. So it's all these things combined to why I think it's such a great war movie, that we see the general's perspective and we see sort of the abandoning and the losing of the forces. Ken Watanabe's character has a great line where he essentially says that, oh, I can't believe the Imperial was even lying to me, thinking that we're still going to win this war and not giving them certain information. Things like, that all our ships are gone, or we're not going to get the airstrikes that we need to necessarily win. And that sort of slow realization as to, oh yeah, we're going to die on this island, most likely, if not definitively. So we understand kind of how this period was in the period of war. Of course, if you watch Flags for Our Fathers, it does give you sort of another perspective on the war. But what I think Clint's able to do is take this battle and try to humanize the side. I mean, this is an American studio looking at a Japanese force, humanize them to make them seem like what they are, which is regular people that are very similar to the other side, kind of fighting over this strange vegetation-less piece of land. where both sides kind of know the outcome, but they still perform it nonetheless. It's this very strange kind of a feeling, but an interesting kind of a fascination on what people do in these situations, the brutality of war, things like that, which I think are so beautifully shot, and beautifully this tone and the atmosphere and the feeling that you get from this movie is so clear, it's so concise because of all these different things, because the first hour is very much no action, all understanding these characters, because of the desaturation, because of how the battle is really, it's 35 days or more, I believe, so it was really stretched out, that it was not just a one fight, that these sort of continual fights over and over again with little sleep, with little food, and makes you feel like you're in that war, but even more invested because, like I said, that first hour you were invested in the characters and all these different things that make this battle really emblematic, and to understand the totality of World War II in this really unique way, particularly the Japanese role in World War II, which ultimately I was really blown away by the movie, and it is kind of sad that it's forgotten. We're now transitioning into that central question as to why it's been forgotten. We've established many reasons in past episodes that are all combination, which I think occur within this movie too. The main one being, though, I think that has a lack of mainstream stars, particularly at the time of release. Ken Watanabe wasn't a huge American star. He doesn't do Inception until a couple years later, for example, just another reference point. But it doesn't have a Brad Pitt or a Helen Mirren or something like that. So that Western audiences, if you're a fan of Brad Pitt, you'll watch all of his movies, right? So you'll probably watch Babel. If you're a fan of Alejandro Inarritu, you'll watch all his movies. This movie, if you're a fan of Clint Eastwood, he has a lot of movies, of course, but you'll probably go back and watch these movies. But they doesn't have sort of that one recognizable star. So if you're a first-time Clint Eastwood movie watcher, you're more likely to watch something like $1 Million Baby because it has a recognizable star in its lead. Of course, this is also in another language, even though it is an American studio movie. It is in Japanese, which, for many foreign movies and international movies, because they're in another language, they're often, even if they're amazing, they're deemed still to, film buffs. I don't know how many people in the popular consciousness know a movie like Come and See, even though within sort of the film buff community it is widely well regarded. I think this movie is in a similar place, that because unfortunately it's in another language, it won't have as much mass broad appeal. It's also a depressing, kind of a somber movie at times, melancholic, which restricts its ability to have rewatches. It's not something that you can pop on easily. You have to be in the right mood. It is kind of a contemplative movie in many ways, so the rewatches hurt, the fact that it's in another language hurts, the fact that it doesn't have a major star in it hurts, and all these different factors I think add up as to why this one has been sort of fallen to the wayside as something like even American Sniper, for example. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know if you've seen this movie, if you like this movie. What are your thoughts on Clint Eastwood's filmography? He's an interesting guy. He wins Best Picture, Best Picture a couple of years earlier. And is still making movies even today. Some of his movies are hit and miss for me, but this one really hit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. If you like the video, also give it a thumbs up. That always helps the channel. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.